Hello and welcome back to InSTEM. If you're interested in pursuing a career in the oil and gas sector, particularly in the times that we're in, then this interview is for you. I'm going to be speaking to Hisham Hamid, who is a chartered chemical engineer and has worked in the oil and gas industry for the past 5 years. I'm going to be speaking to him about his experience of working offshore, his general experience of working in the oil and gas sector, and what the outlook of opportunities are in this sector. I hope you enjoy watching. Thank you. Thank you for coming along to InSTEM, Hisham. Really lovely to have you here with me.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Excited to speak to you about your career in oil and gas. But the new tradition with InSTEM is that we start with an icebreaker question. So we're going to start the discussion with an icebreaker. My question is, if you had to be an expert, or if you could be an expert at a skill, what would it be and why?
Oh, wow. that is a tough one. I think rather than being an expert in a particular skill, I probably need to just get certain skills. So I can't ride a bike and I can't swim. So I would take either of those just as a skill, even like an intermediate child's level of being able to do that. I would take that.
Fair enough. And those are life skills. So.
Life skills, yes.
Because usually with these answers, you get something that people, it's usually quite unattainable for people, but actually you're... So yeah, no, that's really cool. Well, you can achieve both, so yeah.
I don't know if I will, though. It's one of those things that they're both on the list, and the list is never going to get addressed. But
I was doing a little bit of research on you, and you studied chemical engineering at Newcastle University, so Northeast England, for anyone watching and wondering where Newcastle is. That's Northeast England. I've actually never been there, but...
it's an amazing city. It's very famous for Geordie Shore. I don't know if you know the TV show.
Yes, I do remember that show from years ago. I never watched it, but I do remember.
Neither did I. That's where everybody knew it from.
It was an adaptation of an American show.
Jersey
Shore, right? Yeah.
Horrible reality TV, but
I do hope to visit there someday. But yeah, you studied chemical engineering there. You also did, or your degree had some emphasis on sustainable engineering, right? And thinking that. And you started off your career in the oil and gas industry. So I was thinking about that. I thought, you did chemical engineering, you did sustainable engineering, which conveys to me that there's an interest in, renewable energy and sustainability. Then you started your career in oil and gas. So what led you to pursuing a career in the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, a few different factors. And I think you make a really good point on the why study sustainability particularly, and then move into what is the oil and gas industry. So I think the first bit of clarification I would probably make is that for me, I don't perceive the industry as being purely oil and gas. For me, it's more of the energy industry. It's that whole life cycle, right? What I was conscious of is that if I was going to go into a career within that industry, and you never really know when you first start, and you try things, see how they are, and then you can adapt. For me, I wanted to get an understanding of the core and existing business. So namely the oil and gas business. I was working in upstream, and I have worked in upstream for around 4 years, because we're living in a very unique time with respect to the energy transition, and for us to successfully transition efficiently, safely, and economically without detrimentally impacting the regions where we operate, I think it is really important to have that fundamental understanding of the legacy business before making that jump into something new. And what I would say is there's a lot of synergies in what I've done previously as a wells engineer working in oil and gas, that synergies which will be required for the newer business streams. So what do I mean by that? So one of the last wells I did was a water injector well. So designing that, planning it, supervising the construction of it. Fundamentally, that's a skill set that's going to be needed for carbon capture and storage for the future. It's a very similar concept in terms of drilling a well and getting it ready to inject a substance.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a huge technology that needs to be utilized to get the world to net zero and reduce our carbon footprint. So those skill sets, while they may seem unsustainable on the surface, I think the more you delve into it, the more of an understanding that you have of that wider life cycle, the more that you realize that there is a very distinct sustainability lens that needs to be applied to those to get to where we need to be.
It's very interesting and valid, I think, points you've made, actually, and I do agree. I think there are synergies, definitely, and I think there's definitely a need for understanding the legacy businesses you've mentioned. So you currently work for BP. You currently work as a completion engineer. But what I found quite interesting about your experience with BP is you've spent a considerable portion of it working offshore. I'm a chemical engineer like yourself, but I've not really delved into the oil and gas sector. So therefore, I haven't met many people who've worked offshore. And I was quite curious to know what it's like working offshore. You work on the North Sea.
Yeah, I did. So I worked for my first year. I think I did around 150 days of out of maybe 400 offshore. So you typically work on rotation. So your rotation does vary, but I think the standard for the North Sea is like 3 weeks on the rig, 3 weeks off, but it varies depending on your role. Mine tended to vary depending on sort of flexibility of my back-to-back as well. But fundamentally, yeah, it's just it's a whole different world, and I think any perceptions you have before going out there just change when you do go out there. The size and scale of the engineering that you're actually performing it's astronomical. You've got rigs that host 150, 200 people, and they have capabilities to feed them, house them, keep them ticking over. You've got a gym offshore. There was, saunas. I believe there's a sunbed, like games room, full living facilities. I think people don't really have that perception when they think of like an oil rig is what they would call it. I was on a semi-submersible platform, which means that it floats in the sea, it'll drill and complete a well, and then it'll move off and move on to another one. So slightly different dynamic to some of our fixed platforms, which are production platforms. So as an employee of the operator, there may only be 5 or 6 staff from the operating company, so like a BP on the rig at any time. And obviously this varies depending on the type of platform or the type of installation that you're on. And the rest are sort of third parties or specialists, vendors, rig crews, chefs, stewards, stewardesses. So there's a whole plethora and melting pot of different people that are there for specific roles. So it's a real sense of community. The camaraderie offshore is awesome. You spending almost every waking minute with the people that you work with. And there's a lot of benefits to that. There's challenges at times. Obviously, it can be quite isolating when you're not going to your family every night. But as an experience and as a platform to learn, it's phenomenal. At the time, it just goes so quickly, and every day you're submersed in it. And then when you come home, you just unwind. So for me, it wasn't something that I probably would have done long term, but as a experience, it was just invaluable.
That's good to know. So it sounds like you got really good hands-on experience, and a lot of the things that you would get, on the ground in terms of, the community, food and leisure, those things also exist on an offshore platform. I find it quite interesting that you mentioned at the beginning of the interview that you can't swim, yet you spent, a year or 2 offshore. So how did you manage that?
Yeah, it was a year offshore, and before you go out there, you need to demonstrate a certain competency in terms of offshore survival, so that if, God forbid, anything did happen in the way of a capsizing helicopter, you're suitably trained to do your best endeavors to survive that situation. So the training that you do, you essentially go into a metal box which simulates a helicopter. It's submersed into the water, it's turned upside down, and you need to demonstrate that you can get out of the window, activate your life jacket, and essentially float to safety. So that was quite a mental hurdle, I would say. You get a special coloured hat to indicate that you can't swim, so the instructors do look after you. But again, I think there's people there that could swim and they wouldn't get it first time. There's people that couldn't and they got it first time. So luckily I managed to get through everything. I think I'd built it up so much in my head that I had to do it the first time because I didn't want to go back in and do it again. And then in terms of once you're actually off there, I think it's not so much the fact that you're at sea that, gets you if you can't swim. I think it's just the heights. A lot of what you are looking down at is like grates that see through. So that can be it take a little while to adjust to, but after a while, you just get desensitized to it, as with anything. It's scary at first, then for me, I kind of just got over it. It's just your day-to-day reality, right? So you kind of have to get on with it.
Fair enough. You mentioned the word helicopter, and I was thinking you must have experienced some really cool things, being offshore. What was the coolest of them? I'm assuming you got to fly
Yeah,
in a
yes.
helicopter.
So
Really cool.
in terms of how we actually get off onto the rigs or platforms, generally speaking, because of where we are in Aberdeen and where our operations are, we would get one of the little planes that maybe have, you can see the propellers on the outside. Generally speaking, it would be one of those up to the Shetland Islands. They probably host maybe, I don't know, 20 to 40 people on a flight, I would have thought. That's maybe half hour to 40 minutes flying, I would have said. It's been a little while, but I'd say it's between half hour to an hour on one of those flights. You land on Shetland and then you go to one of the heliports and then you get a helicopter out to the rig. And then depending on how far away the rig is, that can be anywhere between half hour, an hour and a half. But it's one of those things that's really cool at the time for the first few times, and then you just get desensitized to it. That's just how you get to work. You get a helicopter to work.
Sounds really cool, but yeah, I can imagine being super nervous about having to get into a helicopter.
I often I fell asleep quite a lot of the time.
Oh, did you?
Honest, just because it rocks you, and you're in your survival suit, which is like a really big thick suit, so that if you were submerged, it keeps you warm, and it's watertight. So yeah, you're very warm. It's rocking. You've got your PPE on, so you've got like ear protection on as well. So I actually found it quite comfortable. I would just fall asleep and then wake up as you're landing.
I think all in all, you've sold working offshore to me. I'm quite keen and interested in working offshore at some point in my career now.
It's definitely worth experiencing.
Yeah, that's really cool. I noticed also that you did a summer internship before you joined BP as a graduate engineer. Would you say that helped you in securing a graduate role? And that's pretty much been the bulk of your career. You've worked, at BP for the past.
Yeah, 100%. So it might be worth highlighting that I did an internship beforehand as well. So in between my second and third year, I remember the prospect of getting an internship and earning a bit of money while you're in uni is just amazing, right? Mm-hmm. So I must have applied. It makes a big difference. Yeah. So I must have applied to, I don't know, 20, 30 different places for internships in my second year. I actually only got through to one interview at the time, and I actually landed that one interview and got the internship. So I did about a year and a half in the pharmaceutical industry. It was slightly extended because it was university term ending all the way to the start of university term. So it was like a full year and then plus the summer. So that was really awesome because I think once you'd had that first taste of working within industry, getting the experience, the lessons that you learn with that, irrespective of what the industry is, it opens up a lot more doors. So yeah, you just have to persevere initially. And then I think in between my third and fourth year, I figured I'd try somewhere else for a summer internship. So I applied for a few different places and had a lot more success than I did initially the previous year. So it just goes to show the value of getting your foot in the door. In terms of how that translated into a graduate program, so we have, generally speaking, for most disciplines where there's availability, we'll offer internships and then grad programs. So not all interns will get converted to graduates, but a certain percentage do every year, right? And it's a good way of really demonstrating to yourself if the company's, the right fit for you, and then also if you're a right fit for the company. So yeah, I went through, delivered a project over around 11 weeks. Then you do an end of internship assessment based on the project that you've delivered, sort of the values, behaviors, what you've demonstrated throughout your time there. And that all gets fed in, combined with the sort of technical knowledge that you've demonstrated. And then, yeah, you can get offered a graduate job on the back of that, which I did. So it was for after I'd finished my master's. So I did the internship, did my master's, and then went back to BP on the grad scheme.
Interesting. I strongly recommend that as well, doing an internship. I think it opens up a lot of doors, but it's going to be the case that some people don't get the opportunity to do internship. So do you have any insight on what they can do alternatively to position themselves for a career with a company like BP or just, the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, so what I would say is don't understate the value of any work that you do whatsoever. So it doesn't necessarily have to be related to the industry that you're going into. What I found was something really simple. Like I worked in retail prior to that first internship, and I'd done that since I was like 16, various different roles. And none of it was significant on paper, right? It was just a standard part-time job that a student would be working. But a lot of the skills that you can demonstrate in those roles, if you're able to articulate that properly, and derive lessons from that kind of a work environment, it'll really set you up nicely for when you do transition into an industrial job. So really try and focus on what you've done in those roles and what skills you've developed, and give examples of those on your CV, on your application. And I think that can help make up for a lack of other experiences in a similar vein. If you do anything extracurricular, any sports, hobbies, volunteering, any interest at all, approach it in a similar way. There's nothing that you do that isn't necessarily going to be a downfall if you can articulate the positives that you get from it. So I would really encourage individuals to think deeply about the stuff that they're passionate about, and try and go for jobs where that is valued.
It's really good advice. Thanks for sharing. You became a chartered engineer last year. And when I was going through your LinkedIn profile, I noticed that you've done a number of different roles in BP. You're currently a completion engineer. You have worked in a wells engineer sort of capacity, drilling engineering, and so on and so forth. I consider that to be quite a successful career, considering the relatively short time that you spent in industry. So I just wanted to find out how you've navigated your career. Has it always been quite easy to get the opportunities that you've been able to take up, or were there challenges? What are the things that you've done to forge a successful engineering career?
I appreciate that. I don't know if I would say I was a successful engineering career but no, I didn't manage to get too much.
You're on a good trajectory at the least,
I
which is successful in itself. Yeah.
Thank you. What I would say is that it was a combination of factors. So firstly, I have to acknowledge that the graduate program we have is pretty awesome. As I said, it was really structured in the sense that we got that offshore experience. You go into the field, you understand and you learn primarily how the operations work. Then I came back into the office and I was designing, planning, and then supervising the construction of the wells that I'd been seeing executed the previous year. So having that continuity was really helpful in bridging the gap. It meant that the learning process was expedited a little bit. A really supportive team that would push you, challenge you. But again, you need to show a willingness to that, right? If you're really hesitant and you have reluctancies about taking on extra work or tackling particular projects and you're not a self-starter, then naturally it's going to be a little bit more difficult to progress. So I was really lucky in the way of the leadership I had. The teams that I work with really worked like a family. They looked out for you. And as I said, they would try their best to develop you as it was in their interests too. I think once you have a team that thinks like that we're all delivering projects together, it really helps develop everybody cumulatively as well. And I think the other thing that I'd probably flag is that given the nature of the work that we do, there's no way one individual can deliver all that work. We really rely on a variety of different stakeholders. So just being able to manage those relationships effectively and collaborate on pieces of work, it will help you sort of progress quicker. And I think when you do your professional chartership, it's not really down to the technical detail for a lot of the attributes that they're looking for in engineers. They're looking for things like innovation, collaboration, some commitment to sustainability, aspects like this, or personal and process safety is another one. So it doesn't really matter what you're doing in engineering. Again, if you try to approach the questions with that sort of a lens, the application process and the actual process of developing you as an engineer becomes a lot more simplistic rather. So.
It's interesting. One of my key takeaways from your answer is you said relationships, managing relationships, and I think that's definitely something that that resonates with me. I think starting your career, you do need that community of people to lean on, to support you, and you will have to be proactive about it, but it's so important to really leverage your network. So that's really good advice. And finally, what's next for you?
What is next for me? Yeah, so I'm actually in between roles at the moment. So I'm moving out of engineering into our people and culture team. So I'll be working on education and employability. So I appreciate that's a bit of a mouthful. What does that mean? As I touched on earlier, there's tremendous opportunity that's coming out of the energy transition. One of the things that we're committed to as an organisation is a just transition. So that is essentially uplifting the communities and the societies that we operate in, whilst not having a detrimental impact on socioeconomics as we progress the energy transition. So the role that I'm working on will be particularly focused on social mobility. So that directly ties into our just transition. whilst also looking at the internal environment within BP, what we can do to be more socioeconomically diverse, and how we can advance education and upskilling of our workforce and our supply chains, the upcoming talent pipeline, such that we have the necessary skills that we need for the energy transition, and that we're able to get to net zero in line with our ambitions. So there's a lot of work ongoing. I think the industry is changing. It's changing for the better. Yeah. And there's a lot of exciting opportunities to come with that.
That sounds really exciting. I definitely think that there's need for more engineers to drive those changes that you've mentioned, and looking forward to having you back to talk to us about, this career move that you're making. I think it sounds amazing.
Appreciate that. Anytime.
Thank you so much, Hisham, for your time. Really insightful.